Hi, my name's Maura. At my sister's engagement party, my mother laughed and told 100 people I was just a secretary. The groom turned to me, confused, and whispered, "Madam Senator?" Yeah, that happened. But it wasn't the insult that cut deepest. It was the years before that. Every dinner I sat through where no one asked about my work, every family photo I was cropped out of, every time I stayed quiet to keep the peace. They didn't just ignore me, they trained the entire room to forget I existed. Want to know what happens when the invisible daughter stops making herself small? I arrived early. I always do. It gives me just enough time to breathe, to observe before I have to play the version of myself my family can stand. The house looked as it always had: white siding, too many floral arrangements in the yard, string lights draped like an event planner had been given unlimited Pinterest boards, and an over-generous budget. Vera, my mother, spotted me first. She didn't smile, just nodded like I was staff checking in. "You're here early," she said, without looking up from a clipboard. "Can you help set the drink station?" I nodded. No hug. No, "How are you?" I moved toward the patio table covered in champagne flutes, placing bottles in coolers and wiping condensation off their necks. I'd been here 20 minutes before anyone else. Not because I was eager, but because punctuality, for me, was armor. Guests began trickling in. First the aunts, then Callista's colleagues, neighbors from the country club, and eventually Benton's family, polished, well-dressed, the kind of people who nod more than they smile. I kept busy, greeting people with a polite but brief hello before stepping back, blending into the layout like a fixture. That's when Vera reappeared. "Maura, you're over there," she said, pointing to a small table at the very edge of the patio, adjacent to the glass doors that led to the downstairs bathroom. She didn't even look at me when she said it. I stared at the table for a beat longer than I should have. 4 seats, a view of the back fence, a faint smell of chlorine from the pool filter nearby. It was the only table not covered in a white linen cloth. I smiled tightly, walked over and sat down. Of course it would be the bathroom table. I'd learned a long time ago that asking why in this house only made things worse. Asking got you labeled dramatic. Questioning meant you weren't grateful, and heaven forbid you wanted a seat at the main table. I adjusted my skirt and set my clutch in my lap. Inside it was the invitation. I brought it with me not because I needed it, but because I couldn't stop looking at it. I pulled it out and unfolded it gently. To Ms. Maura Ellis, Executive Assistant, Public Affairs Office. It wasn't a typo, it was a decision. I don't work in admin. I haven't for years. But apparently, in this house, in this family, your title only matters if they feel like letting it matter. I folded it back up and slid it into the side pocket. Just a prop now, a quiet reminder of the stories people build about you when you stop correcting them. I glanced toward the center of the yard where Callista stood, radiant in a flowy pale pink gown, ring flashing in the sunlight as she held court with Benton's mother. Everyone around her laughed like they were under spell. I caught Benton's gaze for a second. He smiled, genuine, I think, but then his eyes darted away. It was brief, but enough for me to notice. Maybe he was starting to sense something, or maybe he just didn't know where I fit in this perfectly curated tableau. I didn't blame him. Neither did I. There's a kind of loneliness that sneaks in, not when you're by yourself, but when you're surrounded by people who claim to know you and don't even ask. A little boy ran past me, maybe 5 or 6, carrying a paper cup of lemonade too full for his grip. He stumbled, clipped my chair, and the cup tipped forward. Liquid splashed across the stones and dripped onto my bag. Oh, honey, watch out, I said quickly, kneeling down to grab a napkin from the edge of the table. I hadn't even finished blotting the leather when a voice rang out behind me. She's used to it. She cleans up at her office, too. The table burst into laughter. I froze. I didn't have to look up to know who said it. Vera. Her tone was light, like she was being funny, like mocking me had become a reflex she didn't even think twice about. I stayed kneeling for a moment longer, my hand still pressing into the soaked napkin. The laughter carried on. My shoulders didn't shake, but my jaw locked. When I finally stood up, I didn't say a word, but something in me folded differently than the invitation in my bag. The laughter still echoed when I stood up. The napkin in my hand was soaked, not just with lemonade, but with whatever pride I had tried to keep dry at that table. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. The silence did the talking. I glanced at the guests around me, Callista beaming like a pageant queen, Vera tilting her head with that amused, deliberate cruelty she reserved just for me, and Benton, the groom, looking slightly unsettled but still unsure why. A server came by with a clean towel. I thanked her quietly and dabbed the strap of my bag, now sticky from the spill. My dress had a faint yellow stain at the hem, and for a moment I imagined just tearing it off and walking out barefoot through the lawn. But no, too dramatic, too easy. Instead, I smiled at the server, folded the towel into a neat square, and set it on the side of my chair. I returned to the table, took my seat, and tuned out the chatter. At least I tried. So, a woman across from me said, leaning in with a plastic cup of sangria. You work with events, right? I saw you handling the drinks earlier. Her voice was friendly enough. I didn't recognize her. Probably someone's +1. Her bracelet jingled as she gestured toward the bar. I looked at her, measured my breath, and answered with a calm I didn't quite feel. No, I'm family. Just invisible enough to be mistaken for staff, I guess. Her face turned red. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean. It's all right, I cut in, not cruelly, but firmly. You're not the first. You won't be the last. She laughed nervously and shifted her chair away a few inches. I didn't take it personally. It wasn't her fault. They'd trained people to see me this way. This wasn't the first time it had happened. At my cousin Lily's baby shower, someone handed me a trash bag and asked if I could do rounds. At my uncle's retirement party, a guest gave me his coat and said, "Thanks, sweetheart." Even strangers knew how my family saw me. I looked over to the main table. Callista was leaning into Benton's ear, laughing at something he said. Her shoulders shook in that exaggerated way she did when she knew people were watching. Her smile was all teeth. And Vera? She sat tall, sipping from her wine glass like she was presiding over a court rather than her daughter's engagement party. I noticed Benton glance toward me again. He was squinting now. It wasn't judgment, it was curiosity. Something didn't add up, and his brain was quietly trying to complete the puzzle. I didn't give him anything to work with, just met his gaze for a beat, then looked away. The sun was beginning to dip, the string lights above starting to glow. Someone turned on soft jazz through the patio speakers. The tempo didn't match the tension in my chest. I stood and walked to the far end of the yard where fewer people were gathered. Elspeth, my cousin, waved me over from the bench near the rose bushes. "You okay?" she asked, patting the seat beside her. "I'm great," I said, sitting down. "Just needed air." She waited a beat before saying, "They've got you doing laps for wine spills now?" I smiled, barely. "It's tradition. You're handling it better than I would." "Handling's just the polite version of swallowing it whole," I murmured. She reached into her purse and pulled out a chocolate truffle wrapped in gold foil. "You need this more than I do." I took it, grateful, and held it in my palm for a moment before unwrapping it. The sweetness hit my tongue, but it didn't chase the bitterness. Voices rose behind us, Callista again, making a toast. I heard her thank their guests, her future in-laws, even the florist. No mention of me, not even a glance. A few more minutes passed. Benton made his way toward our end of the garden. And he didn't say anything at first, just stood nearby, sipping from his glass, scanning the crowd like he didn't want to be noticed over here. Then, as if asking for the weather, he leaned slightly toward Vera and asked, "Wait, what exactly does Maura do again?" Vera didn't miss a beat. She answers phones, government admin, nothing glamorous. I didn't look at either of them, but I felt his eyes land on me, and this time they didn't turn away. I stepped away from the table and wandered toward the back porch. My heels sank slightly into the grass, but I didn't bother adjusting my gait. I just needed distance from the sting of laughter that still clung to the air like perfume, from my mother's voice wrapped in sugar and knives. The porch was mostly empty, shaded, and quiet, except for the hum of cicadas that had started to rise with the setting sun. I leaned against the railing, pulled out my phone, and opened the last message Vera had sent me earlier that week. "Please don't make a scene. Let Callista have her day. No need to bring up your work stuff." I stared at the text, blinking at it like it might change. I could still remember the day it arrived. I was in my office, 2 floors above a committee hearing room where policies I'd authored were being dissected line by line. That message had pulled me out of the noise of public duty and straight into the private quiet of being diminished. Again. It wasn't the first time. At my law school graduation, Vera gave a toast. She mentioned my brother's business degree and Callista's communications scholarship. Me? Maura has always liked books. That was it. 4 years of top honors, 2 internships, a clerkship already locked in, and all I got was likes books. When I won my first campaign, she said at Sunday dinner, "That's nice, dear. But remember, not everything's about politics. Let's keep family dinners light, okay?" I pressed my thumb against the text thread and held it. A pop-up appeared. "Delete conversation?" I didn't hesitate. Tap. Gone. I leaned back against the railing and looked out over the yard. Guests were laughing near the bar, swaying to soft jazz now pouring out from Bluetooth speakers. Callista twirled a strand of her hair around her finger as Benton whispered something in her ear. She laughed, loud and performative, always aware of an audience. My gaze shifted to the far corner where Jerome, my father, stood with a glass of red wine in hand. Alone, as usual. He wasn't cruel, not overtly. He never mocked me, never raised his voice, but he never once raised it for me either. When I sent him a handwritten invitation to my swearing-in ceremony, I never got a response, not even a "congratulations." I told myself he must have been busy. I pretended to believe it was a scheduling issue, a mix-up at the post office, but I knew better. Deep down, I always knew. Some fathers brag about their daughters. Mine never even mentioned what I did for a living. Maybe he didn't understand it, or maybe understanding it would have forced him to admit how much of me they'd tried to erase. I watched him sip his wine slowly, eyes fixed on the ground, as if making eye contact with his own daughter might burn. The worst betrayals aren't shouted. They're delivered in silence. I stepped away from the porch, winding around the hedges toward the garden lights where the crowd had started to gather. My breath was steady, my hands relaxed. I wasn't trembling, not anymore. That's when I heard her. Callista's voice boomed through the outdoor speaker system. "Every strong woman I know had to fight to be seen, except one, my baby sister. She's always liked staying small." The crowd chuckled. Some nodded. I stood just outside the ring of lights, invisible once again. But this time, I was paying attention to the story being told about me. And for the first time, I was ready to rewrite it. The champagne in my glass had long gone flat by the time Callista tapped the mic. The sound of her nails clicking against it cut through the crowd chatter like the pop of a balloon at a baby shower. Sharp, attention-seeking, rehearsed. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice glowing with theatrical gratitude. This day is a dream." I stayed seated, half shielded by a cluster of oversized hydrangeas arranged near the edge of the patio. The florals were decorative, but for me, they were practical. A partial curtain, a symbolic obstruction. It felt right somehow to be half out of sight at my sister's most photographed moment. Callista's speech continued. She named everyone, every mentor, friend, and high school coach who shaped her journey. She cried when she thanked Vera. She grinned when she thanked Benton. And when she said the words, "I did this on my own," I nearly choked on a sip of champagne. She didn't flinch when she said it, didn't blink. I stared into my glass. My reflection stared back. Did she forget who co-signed her first business loan when she couldn't get approved on her own? Did she forget the late-night calls during her first PR scandal when she begged me to just draft something, anything, to make the story go away? I didn't expect her to stand up there and read a list of my contributions, but to pretend I'd never been part of her story? That burned. I turned to check the faces around me. Benton looked stiff, unsure. His eyes darted toward me for a moment, and I caught it. He knew something wasn't right. The crowd applauded as Callista dabbed at the corner of her eye with a cloth napkin. Not tissue, of course, never tissue, too pedestrian. Then, just as I thought she was winding down, she turned toward the audience with a little giggle. "And then there's Maura," she said, drawing out my name like it was a pet's. A few heads turned. My own breath paused. "Growing up, she followed me everywhere," she said with a laugh. "Like a little shadow. I couldn't go to cheer practice without turning around, and there she was." Laughter erupted. Not cruel laughter, at least not to them, just the kind people give freely when it costs them nothing. Vera laughed the loudest. Callista continued, "It's sweet, really. Some people lead, some people tag along." That's when I felt it. Not pain, not shock, something colder, a kind of clarity that doesn't wait for permission. Elspeth leaned toward me, whispering low but sharp, "You led," but she never looked back. I turned my head slightly, met her eyes. She didn't blink. For once, someone had said the thing out loud. Not just that I mattered, but that they saw how I'd been erased. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I just held my champagne glass a little tighter, grounding myself in the present. I would remember this. Every word, every glance, every laugh that mistook itself for love. They laugh because the pain isn't theirs, I thought. But it doesn't make it less real. When the applause started again, I didn't join in. I stood slowly, stepped back from the hedge, and moved closer to the stone path leading to the side of the house. I didn't need another toast, another tribute. I needed room to decide. As I reached for a bottle of water from the side table, I felt someone approach. Benton. "She really thinks you've done nothing, doesn't she?" he said, voice low, eyes steady. I turned to face him, let the moment settle. "The worst part?" I said, holding his gaze. "She's not the only one." The sting of Callista's speech still lingered like smoke in my throat as the cocktail hour rolled on. Guests drifted through the garden, drinks in hand, laughter bubbling like a language I hadn't spoken in years. I returned to my corner by the edge of the patio, the same table they'd stuck me at near the bathroom door, still trying to piece together the emotion I hadn't let show during her toast. A tray clattered to the ground. Wine splashed across the grass in a thick streak, some droplets landing dangerously close to Callista's ivory heels. The server knelt instantly, apologizing, napkin in hand. But before he could clean the spill, Vera's voice sliced across the music. "Maura, grab a napkin, dear. Help us out here." I froze, not because I didn't hear her, but because I did. Everyone else heard it too. Several heads turned. The server paused, confused. I hesitated, but the quiet expectation in that moment felt louder than any yell. So I moved. I stepped forward, bent down, and started blotting the stone with a cocktail napkin someone handed me. I wasn't wearing a name tag, but it didn't matter. I might as well have been in a uniform. As I stood up, a man I didn't recognize, a friend of one of the in-laws maybe, walked over with a drink in one hand and a $5 bill in the other. He smiled politely and pressed it into my palm. "Thanks, sweetheart. You folks are really on top of things." I stared at the bill. Just stared. Not because it was offensive. It was. But because it was so expected. Like he was just playing his part in the script my family had handed out to every outsider who entered our circle. I didn't say anything. I just folded the bill neatly and slid it into the side pocket of my clutch, right next to the misprinted invitation that had called me an executive assistant. I wasn't keeping it out of need. I was keeping it like evidence. There's a particular kind of ache when you realize strangers see you exactly how your family has painted you. Helpful, background, replaceable. I turned back toward the group, adjusting the strap on my shoulder. Vera was laughing again, waving her hand like it was all harmless. Callista hadn't even noticed. I wandered toward the other end of the garden. That's when I heard it. Callista's voice again, light and polished as ever, talking to one of Benton's law firm partners. "She's always said that, you know," she told him. "Reputation is what others think of you. Character is what you live with." My spine went cold. That line, those exact words, I had written them. Not just in conversation. I had typed them, carefully crafted, during a PR nightmare 2 years ago when Callista's branding agency had landed in a legal scuffle over intellectual property violations. I had written the entire damage control memo. She cried when I sent it to her, told me I saved her career. And now she was reciting it, smiling, sipping rosé while her guest nodded in admiration like she was Socrates in a sundress. I didn't interrupt. I just watched her bask in a reflection she didn't earn. She wasn't just stealing my voice anymore. She was wearing my thoughts. She stole my thoughts, not just my voice, my mind, I whispered under my breath. Callista laughed again, charming and bright. The guest laughed too. No one asked where the words came from. I turned and walked back toward the hedge line, back toward the solitude that had become a kind of ritual this evening. But I wasn't walking away in defeat this time. It was strategy. Back near the porch, I pulled my phone out and scrolled to an old folder I hadn't opened in months. Swearing-in ceremony, confidential remarks. Inside were notes I had written for my official speech the day I took office. I'd trimmed it down, kept it professional. But there was one line I never used, one I wasn't sure they'd let me get away with. I found it. The most powerful people don't raise their voices, they raise standards. I stared at the line for a long time, then locked my screen and slid the phone back into my purse. That spark they'd been trying to bury. It wasn't out. It was just waiting. Golden hour painted the backyard in soft amber. The string lights flickered to life, casting warm halos around the hydrangeas and wine glasses. It should have been a serene moment, the kind that lives in family photo albums and holiday reels. But I was still reeling from what Callista had said earlier, the way she erased me in front of 100 people without breaking a sweat. I had taken a walk to cool off, circling the far side of the garden path, when a woman approached me near the trellis. Middle-aged, expensive shoes, holding a Pinot Noir like it was a clutch. "Excuse me," she said, tilting her head thoughtfully. "I think I saw you on C-SPAN last month. Judiciary Subcommittee hearing. Are you—" Before I could reply, Vera's voice snapped in like a fly swatter. "Oh, she works in admin. Government titles are so confusing for people outside D.C. Don't worry about it." The woman's eyebrows rose. She gave a short, embarrassed laugh and nodded. "Of course." "Well, lovely party." And she turned away. I didn't move. My mother hadn't even looked at me when she said it. She just kept walking, off to laugh with someone else, as if she'd just corrected a typo. That woman wasn't just a guest, she was a donor, a name I recognized from policy briefings. But none of that mattered, because Vera had made sure no one looked too long. She hadn't just interrupted me, she rewrote me. It's not always the lie that breaks you. It's when they force others to believe it, too. I pressed my lips together and inhaled through my nose. I could have marched after that woman, explained my credentials, pulled up my Senate page right there on my phone. But I didn't. Instead, I turned toward the arch at the back of the lawn, where a few relatives had gathered, chairs in a half circle, wine bottles nearly empty. They laughed a little too loud, the way people do when they've forgotten how to be honest. Vera stood at the center, holding court again. And just as I neared, I heard her say it. "It was the worst year of my life," she sighed dramatically. "I had no one, but I got through. I'm a survivor." I stopped cold. No one. I had canceled meetings. I had arranged for a private specialist. I had flown in from committee hearings, missed votes to be at her side. I had coordinated with her doctors, argued with her insurance, brought her soup, hired home aides she pretended to afford. Flashbacks crashed in, me sitting in the hospital hallway with my laptop open, amending healthcare amendments between texts from Vera about her blood pressure and which nightgown felt scratchy. And now, here she was, rewriting the narrative like a screenwriter who'd never met the main cast. "I carried her silence," I whispered to myself. "She repays me by pretending I was never there." I didn't step forward. I didn't say a word. I just turned, steady on my heels, and made my way back toward the house. My hand gripped my phone so tightly, the corners bit into my palm. Inside the foyer, near the gift table, was a board propped on an easel, with gratitude. Names were printed in gold on thick paper under the words, "To those who made this day possible." I scanned the list. My name wasn't there. Actually, it was misspelled. Maura Ellis, right under the words, "Admin Support." Next to it, a blank space where another name might have gone. Or maybe it had never been typed at all. I stood there, absorbing it, not in shock, but in clarity. There was no mistake. It wasn't forgetfulness. This was a pattern, and patterns are choices. I ran my fingers once over the edge of the board, straightened it slightly, then, under my breath, I said it out loud for the first time all evening. Let's see what happens when I stop helping them stay comfortable. Dessert had just been set out, tiny cheesecakes on mirrored trays, macaron towers engineered for photos more than flavor. Guests buzzed around the dessert table with the energy of people who'd had just enough wine to compliment strangers and forget boundaries. Callista stood in the center, holding out her hand so another guest could admire her ring. For the 5th time that evening. "It's a custom piece," she said, voice soft and practiced. "Benton had it designed just for me. Isn't it gorgeous?" The woman next to her gasped, then leaned closer. "It's so modern, but still timeless. I've never seen a setting like that before." I froze. 2 years ago, I reviewed a legislative brief about intellectual property violations in boutique design. The case had included that exact ring style: twisted platinum band, offset solitaire, crescent underlay. The design had been flagged for infringement, and I'd written the language that would eventually protect the original artist. And now here it was, on Callista's finger. Of course, I didn't say a word, just stared for a moment too long. Benton caught my eye and tilted his head. "Everything all right?" I nodded slowly. "That design has a strong origin story." He chuckled, uncertain. Callista didn't notice. Or maybe she did and pretended not to. Either way, the moment passed, like most moments in my life when truth threatened to step forward but was taught to wait in the hallway. Some people don't build, I thought. They just decorate themselves with what others created. It wasn't about the ring, not really. It was what it symbolized, how she wore something stolen, polished it, and smiled like it belonged only to her. As the evening moved toward speeches again, guests began returning to their seats. A new stack of programs had been laid out on each table, family words of gratitude. I unfolded mine. Benton's name was there, twice. One as youngest partner Hartford Locke, the second as beloved fiancé. My father, family rock. Callista, bride, founder, creative director. And me, administrative contributor. Italicized, no title, no role, no name. They didn't just minimize me, they officially made me a ghost. I turned the page. Everyone else had their full names. Everyone else had a title that meant something, or at least sounded like it did. I stared at that phrase, administrative contributor, as if looking at it long enough would summon a truer version. But there was nothing else beneath it. No Maura Ellis, no senator, not even a first name. My jaw tightened, but I didn't let the emotion rise. I folded the program, stood, and slipped it into my bag next to the $5 bill and the invitation they misprinted. This wasn't about forgetting. This was about erasing. I took a long breath and walked away from the table, heading back toward the main path. The light from the string bulbs caught on the edge of a framed photo display, and for the first time all evening, I saw the one picture they used of me, cropped from a group photo at my law school graduation. No cap, no gown, just the edge of my smile. I walked past the main table where Vera sat, sipping Pinot, her laugh ringing out over the clink of forks. "Elspeth," I said, coming up behind her. She turned, eyebrows raised like she already knew. "I'm not going to let them finish this party pretending I never existed." Her lips curled into something closer to a smirk than a smile. "Good," she said, pulling a cream envelope from her clutch. "Because I kept the envelope, just in case." I took it, held it flat in my palm. I didn't have to open it. I knew what it was. I looked up, straight ahead at the mic stand waiting under the arbor where toasts would resume in minutes. Then I looked back at Elspeth. Ready to burn the script? Callista tapped the mic again, a gentle test, like she was preparing for a TED Talk. She stood under the arbor now, light catching the sequins in her dress, spotlighted by nature and her own design. "Before we wrap," she said, raising her champagne glass, "I want to offer one last toast." People hushed. Benton leaned forward, polite, practiced. I sat still in my chair, eyes low but listening. That's when he got up. "Excuse me," Benton said quietly, brushing past her. "1 second." Callista's smile faltered for half a breath, but she recovered. "Refill?" she joked. He gave a quick nod and walked, straight toward me. I didn't move. He stopped at my side and leaned in, voice low. "Just to clarify, Maura Ellis, Senate Judiciary Committee?" I turned my head. "Yes." He blinked. "You're Senator Ellis?" "Yes." I said again. The glass in his hand dipped, sloshed a little. He didn't hide his surprise. In fact, it settled in his shoulders like bricks. He looked like a man realizing the map he'd been using was printed upside down. The patio, the music, the hum of crickets, it all seemed to pause. People sensed it. Conversations quieted. A few turned to look, unsure what they were witnessing. He opened his mouth, closed it again, then just nodded. I stood, not because he had given me reason, but because it was time. Callista had just gestured back to the mic. I moved before she could call me out. Maura, she said, catching herself mid-toast. Why don't you say a few words? Just something quick, since you've been so helpful. It was the tone, sweet enough to pass as generous, sharp enough to bruise. I walked to the front, heels clicking softly on the stone path. No one clapped. Not yet. I didn't reach for the mic. I didn't need it. Instead, I pulled an envelope from my bag, off-white, sealed with a single gold sticker. I set it gently on the mic stand. Inside, a copy of my Senate swearing-in remarks, a photo from the ceremony, and a typed note addressed simply, "To whom it should have mattered." I turned back to the crowd, looked no one in the eye, then walked off the stage without a word. The silence was heavier than any applause would have been. Vera blinked, frozen in place. Callista's smile was gone now, replaced with something harder to define, an edge of panic beneath the polish. Elspeth, in the back, offered the smallest nod. I wasn't there to perform. I was there to end the performance. This was never about recognition, I whispered to myself as I reached the edge of the path. It was about reclamation. Behind me, the room, or the lawn, technically, froze. Then the sound of rustling paper. Callista tore open the envelope. She skimmed its contents, the color draining from her cheeks. Her voice trembled. You planned this. I paused near the open gate, turned slightly. No, I said calmly. You wrote it for me. I just stopped erasing it. Callista's hands trembled as she held the contents of the envelope, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the edges of the paper. She scanned the photo, the speech, the note. Her mouth opened slightly, as if she wanted to laugh, but nothing came. Oh, this is theatrical, isn't it? She said finally, forcing a laugh that bounced off silence. No one joined her. Benton stepped away. It wasn't dramatic, just a quiet pivot of the body, the kind you don't notice until the space he leaves behind feels colder. Elspeth stood by the garden wall, arms folded, saying nothing but watching everything. Vera reached for her wine glass. It clinked against the saucer on the table. She missed the handle the first time. Her smile had vanished. All I did was stand near the path, just far enough from the spotlight, just close enough for everyone to feel me. That was all I ever needed. I didn't need to shout, I thought. The truth was loud enough. Somewhere near the back, an aunt I barely recognized whispered, "Is that really her? Senator Ellis?" Callista shook the envelope slightly like it might change contents if she rattled it hard enough. Let's not make this about her, she said, voice thinner now, stretching. Benton turned to face her. You already did. That hush, that kind that follows something irreversible, spread like a low fog. The energy shifted. The air didn't move, but every gaze did. And they weren't looking at Callista anymore. They were looking at me. For the first time, not through the lens of Vera's stories or Callista's rephrasing. They were seeing me, many of them for the first time, without filters. I didn't smile. I didn't wave. I didn't need to perform anymore. I took a step toward the edge of the path, letting the moment sit. Then a voice behind me, soft, unfamiliar. Senator? I turned. It was a young server, maybe early 20s. He looked nervous but sincere. "I just wanted to say I admire your work. I saw your name during the subcommittee sessions on healthcare. It meant something to us." I paused, then gave a small nod, my voice even. "Thank you. That means something to me too." He walked off quietly, back toward the buffet. Vera watched from across the space. She didn't speak. Her eyes didn't meet mine. She looked through me the way people do when they can't afford to look directly at the consequences of what they've done. A stranger saw me, I thought. My mother still looks through me. I let that line settle in my chest. It didn't ache the way it used to. It just confirmed what I already knew. Flashbulbs from my confirmation hearing flickered in my memory. Flashes, applause, voices saying my name like it mattered. Then came Sunday dinners where the loudest praise was for casseroles and Callista's Instagram growth. Sometimes, I remembered, the loudest silence is the one between you and someone who should have protected you. I walked toward the outer lawn, farther from the crowd, sipping what remained of my champagne. It had gone flat, but the bitterness worked. Benton caught up to me. He didn't say anything at first, just stood beside me, watching the wind ripple through the string lights overhead. "She lied to me about you," he said quietly. "All this time." I kept my gaze forward. "That's what she does. But now, you've seen it too." He hesitated. "Would you stay a few minutes? I need to talk." I looked down at my empty glass, rolled the stem between my fingers. "That depends," I said. "Are you ready to hear me now?" The morning after the engagement party was unusually quiet. No buzzing phones, no follow-up emails, just stillness and a sky that couldn't decide if it wanted to rain or burn off the haze. I was making coffee when my phone rang. Vera. I let it ring 3 times before answering. "Hi, Maura," she said, her tone artificially light. "I hope you're rested. Last night was a lot." "It was," I said simply. She cleared her throat. "Look, now that things are out in the open, maybe it's time you think about a change of pace. All that DC stress, it wears on people. There are plenty of respectable roles here, you know. Something simpler, less demanding." Simpler, less demanding. She said it like an olive branch, but it cut like a blade wrapped in velvet. The suggestion wasn't about care. It was control in disguise. "You want me invisible again?" I said evenly. "But now you know it's not possible." There was a beat of silence on the other end. Then she sighed. "This family's had enough drama." "It's not drama when it's truth," I replied. "It only feels disruptive when people benefit from the lie." She didn't respond, just ended the call with, "Well, let's not hold on to things. Life's too short." By noon, I was at Elspeth's place, returning the envelope. She welcomed me in like I was a regular visitor, not the woman who just set her entire family's narrative ablaze. We sipped tea, made small talk about her hydrangeas, the weather, anything but what happened. Then her granddaughter, maybe 6, ran into the room, eyes bright. "Are you the lady who helps with the kitchen?" Elspeth's face paled. "Sweetheart." But I held up a hand. I crouched down to the girl's level and smiled. "What made you think that?" She shrugged. "Grandma said you don't like big crowds, that you're quiet like the helpers." I nodded slowly. "I do help people," I said softly. "But not with the kitchen." She grinned and skipped off toward the hallway, utterly satisfied with the answer. Elspeth looked stricken. "I didn't mean it like that. I was trying to explain your, well, private." I sat back down. "I know, but she didn't hear private. She heard less. That's what sticks." We both stared into our cups for a while. They start teaching the wrong version of you before you even speak, I said finally. The cycle doesn't break because someone shouts louder. It breaks when someone tells a new story. I stood, slid the envelope back onto her entry table. Thank you for keeping it. You knew before I did what it would mean. She reached for my arm as I turned. I'm sorry I didn't say more, sooner. I nodded. We all said enough. Just not what mattered. The air felt different outside. Lighter, maybe. Or maybe I was just breathing easier. As I buckled my seatbelt, my phone buzzed. A message from Benton. Would you meet me? I've made a decision. And it starts with honesty. Benton chose a quiet cafe on the corner of Wisconsin Avenue, one of those places that never got trendy enough to be crowded. I arrived first, ordered black coffee, and claimed a table near the window. No makeup, no power suit, just me in jeans and a navy sweater that I kept for days I didn't need to prove anything. He walked in 5 minutes later, looking like someone who'd slept in his thoughts. He didn't waste time. I'm sorry, he said, pulling out the chair across from me. Not just for not knowing, but for not asking. I think I wanted a version of you that was simpler to fit into the story I'd already been told. I nodded. No need to comfort him. He wasn't here to be forgiven, and I wasn't here to offer that. I admired you, he added. Before I met Callista, I watched you handle that Senate hearing last year. I just never connected the name. You weren't supposed to, I said gently. They made sure of that. He looked down. You don't owe me anything. No, I agreed. But if you want to live in truth, start with yourself. He didn't argue, just sat with it, let it land. We spoke for another 15 minutes about the future, about the weight of pretending. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't even dramatic. It was real, and sometimes that's the rarest thing of all. Later that week, a package arrived at my home. No return address, no note, just a plain brown box. Inside was a small silver frame, a photo of me at 10 years old, holding a plastic law book and smiling with a gap-toothed grin. Vera had taken that photo. I remembered because she'd told me to stop slouching. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I placed it on my bookshelf behind a row of political biographies, not hidden, but not displayed either. She didn't apologize, I thought. She just acknowledged I existed. That's a start, not a solution. I remembered something a therapist once told me in a session I never went back to. Healing doesn't mean reopening the door. Sometimes it means knowing you'll never knock again. I spent the afternoon rearranging my office. The framed photos of family barbecues and graduations came down. In their place, I hung framed copies of legislation I'd helped pass, a snapshot of my team celebrating outside the Capitol, and a newspaper clipping of my first speech on the floor. The photo from my swearing in, where Elspeth was the only family member in attendance, had always sat on the side table. I replaced it with a new image, one of me, alone, standing on the Senate floor, looking upward just slightly. I stared at it for a long time, then whispered to myself, I wasn't alone. I was just early. The room felt different, lighter, truer. That night, while sorting mail at my desk, I found it. A letter, handwritten, no stamp, no name. Just my name on the envelope and one line across the front. For when you're ready to understand why I stayed silent. I didn't open it, not yet. I placed it in the drawer beside me. For now, the silence was mine to keep. Rain tapped softly on the window like a second hand counting down something I couldn't name. I sat at my desk, lights low, a blanket over my knees I didn't remember grabbing. The letter had sat unopened for days. I hadn't looked at it, hadn't moved it, but I'd always known I would read it, just not for her, never for her. For me. I broke the seal slowly. Inside, on thin ivory paper, was Vera's handwriting. Still sharp, still slanted right, still the script of someone who had grown used to having the last word. Maura, I know what I did. I've known for longer than I'll ever admit out loud. You were never invisible. You were just inconvenient. You made everything I said about Callista feel smaller. I told myself you didn't need applause. You had titles. You had votes. You had the world. But I see now, it was never about need. It was about respect. I don't expect forgiveness. I only wanted to stop lying to myself. V. I stared at the page for a long time. There was no trembling in my hands, no lump in my throat, just clarity, like stepping into a cold room and realizing the fire had burned out hours ago. Some truths don't deserve to live in writing, I whispered. I lit a match. It caught instantly. The paper curled inward, blackening until the flame reached the last curve of her signature. I dropped it into a ceramic bowl and watched it turn to ash. 2 weeks later, I stood under the high ceiling of a ballroom downtown, the echo of footsteps, camera clicks, and hushed admiration rolling beneath the chandeliers. It was the annual Justice for Women Gala. I'd been asked to give the closing keynote. I walked to the stage. Elspeth was in the front row. Benton sat a few rows back, hands clasped, eyes steady. As I approached the mic, I noticed them, Callista and Vera, seated near the exit, shoulders tight, faces neutral. I hadn't invited them, but power draws moths, even the ones who once tried to dim it. A journalist called from the aisle. Senator, you've spoken a lot about personal strength. Can you share a bit about the support you had along the way? Your family? I paused, looked straight ahead. Let the silence stretch just long enough to matter. Family, I said, isn't always who claps for you the loudest. Sometimes it's the people who stayed silent until they had to choose truth over comfort. No one clapped immediately. It took a second. Then it rippled. Real, honest applause. Not for the mic drop, for the message. Vera didn't blink. Callista folded her arms. I turned from the mic. After the event, I updated my public bio. Gone were the phrases about legacy, upbringing, or family values. It read simply, self-made, uninvited, but unavoidable. That same week, I filed a redirection notice. The Family Trust Fund, long controlled by Vera, would now seed a scholarship initiative. Full-ride law education for young women who had been told to stay in their lane. Benton texted again a few days later. You inspired more than you hurt. I replied, that was always the plan. And then came the next speech. Another session. Another gallery of eyes. I stood on the Senate floor and spoke about institutional accountability. How silence, when codified, becomes violence. As I stepped down, my aide approached me with a folded piece of paper. From someone in the gallery, she said. I opened it. Thank you. I thought I had to shrink to be loved. You reminded me I don't. I folded the note, tucked it into my blazer pocket, and walked forward. Let the silence be theirs now.